Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Bible with Bruce. Hey, before I go any further, I want to take a moment to apologize. I know that I was supposed to post a video on Sunday and Monday, and I didn't do that. And so now I feel like the kid that has turned in his homework late and that's still asking for a good grade. So if you do like this video, please still like and subscribe at the end of the video. And I also want to take a moment to be a little transparent with you and really just kind of show a little bit of behind the scenes of what happens sometimes with teachers and pastors and lay people in the church. I took some time off teaching, and it's been almost 3 years since I taught the Bible consistently. And to be honest with you, I spent last week really asking myself, man, can I do this? Do I really have what it takes? Am I really cut out for this? It was really emotional, and I just needed some time to process. That being said, I'm glad you're here now. So thank you so much for tuning in. And speaking of thank you so much to my good friend Joseph, who gave us Monday's mail question of the day. In fact, today I'm actually going to combine a devotional, Monday's mail, and Wednesday's word. Why? Because this is a lot to unpack. This is a huge question. I'm going to read it to you now. This is from Joseph. It says, "Hey PB, in Genesis chapter 2, it says there was no man to till the ground. But in Genesis chapter 1, 26 through 29, God already created male and female. Also, when Cain was kicked out, he said others would kill him. What other people was he talking about?" Joseph, thank you for asking that question. That actually got me fired up because this is the type of stuff I love to dive into. And this has been a debate for scholars for centuries. So welcome to a huge debate. Some of you that are familiar with the Bible and that study the Bible closely, you realize that there's actually two creation stories in the book of Genesis. We see that here. And I want to take a moment to talk about why there's two different creation stories and to help kind of answer some of these questions, right? So in Genesis chapter 1, we read about the 6 days of creation. Many of us are familiar with it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. It's God creating the cosmos. God is creating the world, the big picture of what God is doing, right? And in fact, it's described as formless and void. Those are two Hebrew words. Wednesday's word, by the way, word of the day for Wednesday. Tohu and bohu. Tohu means formless. Bohu means void. So when you look at the next 6 days of creation, God is solving these two problems. Tohu and bohu. Formless and void. In fact, days number 1 through 3, God is solving the tohu problem by creating form into the universe. Days number 3 through 6, God is solving the bohu problem by filling the void or by filling that emptiness with, things that God has created. So, for example, day number 1, we know God created light. He created light and separated light and darkness. We know that in day number 1. In day number 2 of creation, God separated the waters from the air and he created an atmosphere. In day number 3, God separated the waters from the land and exposing vegetation. That's days 1, 2, and 3. He's creating form to the universe. Now let's look at the bohu, days number 4, 5, and 6. Now, I want to point this out. If you look at day number 1, it actually corresponds with day number 4. Day number 2 corresponds with day number 5, and day number 3 corresponds with day number 6. Watch this. Remember, on day number 1, God, created light. He said, "Let there be light." So on day number 4, it talks about how God filled the sky with stars and the moon. And so he's filling the heavens, which he created in day number 1. And day number 2, remember, God separated the waters in the air. Well, in day number 5, here God is, he is filling the air with birds, and he's filling the water with sea creatures. And then, of course, day number 3, we have the the earth. God is bringing forth the earth out of the waters. He's exposing the earth, right? The land. And then what do we have in day number 6? God creates the beast of the field and his crowning achievement, humans. So days 1, 2, and 3 and days 4, 5, and 6 actually kind of parallel each other. Now, one cool thing about this is if you pay close attention, you'll realize that the creation story in Genesis actually is very similar to some of the other creation stories of the ancient world. Very similar to the creation story of ancient Egypt, of the Canaanites, of the Babylonians. In fact, one of the big differences, though, is that is that the Israelites had one God that they served, and that their one God created these things. In some of the other stories, they looked at these things as deities or entities themselves. They looked at the sun and the moon as gods. Or here, Israel in Genesis is cutting them down to size, and they're saying, no, the sun and the moon aren't gods. In fact, they're here to serve God and serve man by giving us the times and the seasons. And so that's what the purpose of them are. And so that being said, I want to take a moment also now to look at Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis chapter 2, it says, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth. Now, Genesis chapter 1, we have this big overall focus of God creating the universe, God creating the cosmos, tohu and abohu, and filling everything in it. Now, Genesis chapter 2 is a more zoomed in focus. It's not about the cosmos anymore. Now it's about a man, a woman, a garden, and the commands that God gives them. So, some scholars believe that Genesis chapter 2 is just a more detailed story of Genesis chapter 1. In other words, Genesis chapter 1 tells the overall story, and then Genesis chapter 2 kind of zooms in and gives a more detailed explanation of the same story. Now, that's a very common view. It's very common among a lot of scholars, and here's why. Because we don't know how much time has passed between the time that Adam and Eve had Cain and Abel, and when Cain killed Abel, and Abel was and so a lot of people really do believe that this is just a more detailed telling. Now, that's one interpretation, but now there's also another theory that I want to share with you. It's kind of an alternative interpretation. That I don't necessarily know that this is retelling the same story, because when you really dive in and look at the second creation story, the story of Adam and Eve, there's a lot of differences there. It looks to me as if this is a completely separate story altogether. That it's not a repeat of Genesis chapter 1, but it's a shift in theological focus. Because the Bible doesn't specifically say that Adam and Eve were the first man and woman on earth. Now, before you start coming at me with your pitchforks and your torches, let's unpack that a little bit and let me say why I think this can be a completely separate creation story. And this particular story is focused on Israel, not necessarily the cosmos. So the first creation story, Genesis chapter 1, I believe is talking about how God created the universe as a whole. Genesis chapter 2 begins where God is creating Israel, and it's telling Israel's origin story. Keep in mind, Israel was unique because it was a monotheistic religion. Other religions at the time worshiped many gods. Here Israel is, they were set apart. They were completely different than the other nations. There's a couple of things here that gives us these clues. Number one, let's look at the parallels between Adam's life and Adam's story and Israel's story. Number one, we know Adam is formed of the dust of the ground. Number two, Adam is placed in he's placed in Eden, which is this land that God has given him. God also gives Adam and Eve commands that they eventually disobey and that they're eventually exiled for, right? Now, let's look at Israel's story as a whole. Israel's story is told in what we call the Pentateuch, which is a Greek word that means 5, or the Torah, which is a Hebrew word that means the law. The Pentateuch or the Torah are the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The purpose of these 5 books are to tell Israel's story and in their journey. So, in this journey with Israel, here God, and we look in the book of Exodus, We see God is recreating Israel out of the dust of slavery. He brought them to a land that he's given them, which is Canaan. He gives them commands and laws, which they ultimately disobey, and they're ultimately exiled from their land, just as it was with the garden. So I don't necessarily know that Genesis chapter 2 might be telling the same story, but it might be a theological shift where God's not necessarily talking about, where the Bible's not necessarily talking about the creation of humanity anymore, but now the creation of Israel. And why did he create Adam from the dust of the ground? Remember, Israel's supposed to be set apart from the rest of the world. So, why do I think they're two completely different stories? Let's compare the two. Let's take a moment to unpack, right? So in Genesis chapter 1, we see that God creates man last. He also creates them together. He created male and female after he creates the animals. Well, in Genesis chapter 2, he creates man first, places man in the garden, and then creates the animals, and then creates Eve. So I don't think these are contradictions. In fact, they seem to be two very different theological focuses. They're not telling the same truth from different angles, but it's like there's two completely different creation stories. Again, the first one being the creation of the world and humanity, the second one being the creation of Israel. And then let's look at that. For example, Genesis chapter 1, God is very transcendent. He's authoritative. He speaks things into existence. He's sovereign. He speaks and things happen. And then in Genesis chapter 2, we see him more immanent, more human-like. He's creating out of the dust of the ground. He's creating and forming it with his own hands. He's walking in the garden in the cool of the day with man. He's more present. And this is also a theme that we see throughout the Bible, where God is both sovereign, in control, but yet present and still walks with us daily as well. And so what makes sense to me is that God created humanity in Genesis chapter 1, and in Genesis chapter 2, he sets Adam apart. And just like he sets aside Israel and Abraham, he sets them apart. And so this could be the theological beginning of Adam's story. And Israel is tracing their lineage all the way back to Adam. Now, that being said, that also helps answer the question, were there other people here with Adam and Eve? And so that's one necessarily way to read that. In fact, that particular view was made popular by a Bible scholar, Dr. Peter Enns, and that's the one that makes the most sense to me. Now, I'm not saying this is the only way to read and interpret this. I'm not saying it's the right way to read and interpret this. There's several different ways to read and interpret why there are two different creation stories in the Bible. This one particularly makes just more sense to me, that God created the universe and the cosmos, and he created the beasts of the field and humanity. And then in Genesis chapter 2, again, is the introduction of Israel's story, where God is introducing Israel into the world now, and they are set apart because Israel's lineage was through Adam, who was set apart completely from the rest of mankind. God created him, and then his story parallels that with the rest of Israel's story in the Bible. It also makes sense because it helps answer the question about whether or not, why there were other people here after God created Adam and Eve, and why they were already out and not in the garden, why they were exiled, right? And so it kind of helps to answer that question a little bit. It's the one that makes sense to me. Again, I'm not saying it's the only way or the right way to read it, but it's just one that makes sense to me. So, let me know what you think. Have you heard of a theory like this before? Drop your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Also, please feel free to email me at bruce@brucesims.org. I'd love to get more questions. I love to dive into stuff like this. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you next week.